Hey, how are you?
Hi, Chloe.
How are you?
Great. Nice meeting you again.
My mouth is full.
Yeah.
How are you?
Great. It's been
Come on in.
fantastic. A little bit of rain makes everything romantic.
Yeah, it seems like every day I've been here it's rained.
Yeah.
I don't know what the reason for that is, but... So, what's going on?
So, first of all, my name is Yang.
Yeah.
I was just beside you
Yes,
in
no,
the first session.
Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Yeah,
And,
so I'm the first year PhD student for
you're-
sociology.
Wow, I didn't realize that you were going to do that.
Yeah, that means I'm old.
What were you doing? What were you doing before you got here to do the PhD?
I was doing my master here as well. I was
In
political science.
Mhm.
I also talked with some of your colleagues, you know, like
Good.
Wendy Sherman.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great.
So asking about the question relating to Obama doctrine, and she was very dismissive of this term. So I have 3 questions today.
Sure.
I'm prepared on this tablet. So let's first talk about culture and games. Henry Kissinger is a very established foreign policy strategist. He's well known in China, and he once distinguished between American and Chinese foreign policy strategists by pointing out that Americans play chess and the Chinese play Weiqi or Go.
Yeah.
And Weiqi implies a concept of strategic encirclement and generates strategic flexibility, whereas chess is about total victory and it produces single-mindedness.
Yeah.
There are other metaphors, like Garry Kasparov,
Yeah.
to defend the honor of
Yeah.
chess. He
Yeah.
said Putin is playing poker.
Yeah.
So how do you assess all these metaphors in terms of foreign policy culture against the reality of the world? And if they are all good metaphors, how could China and the United States coexist and co-evolve in the 21st century with such differing foreign policy styles?
It's a really interesting question, and I think part of the challenge is whether you conceive of any of these games as requiring zero-sum outcomes, win-lose outcomes. I think the metaphor, the analogy, in most real-world situations, not all, but most, to me falls apart because I think most of the outcomes that we seek are actually not zero-sum outcomes. They're hopefully win-win, or at least not lose-lose outcomes.
Yeah.
And to the extent you're stuck in a scheme or in a game that can only have a win-lose zero-sum outcome, that to me doesn't actually reflect much, not all, but much of what we do every day. Where the real question is, to me, I think of it mostly more like a Venn diagram. And is there in any problem that where we're dealing with a different partner with some different interests, different motivations, different politics, is there nonetheless some Venn diagram moment where, for whatever reason, enough interests align that we can find a positive outcome? That's how I see most things that we do around the world. Now, there's some places where there is an absolute conflict of interests. There's not really a Venn diagram moment, and then yes, maybe you're into more of a zero-sum game, and then you can decide, okay, how do we play it? What game do we want to be playing?
Yeah, from your vantage point as Deputy Secretary for the State Department, do you find that, Chinese strategists, they are very different in style from Americans? Americans are very, solution-oriented.
Yes.
You see that,
Right.
you see a problem, you ask
Right.
a question, and you
Right.
solve it.
Exactly.
But for Chinese, they're very ambiguous. Sometimes we say they are strategically ambiguous, and they do not believe in permanent solutions.
Right.
And to Beijing, the solution is simply an admission ticket to another problem. So how do you see this style playing out in this very complicated 21st century? Which one would win out, and in what combination would be the best outcome?
You're right. I think there are different styles, different ways of doing things, and if to some extent you're right that the American approach tends to be problem solving, and maybe the Chinese approach is more problem avoidance, which is perfectly rational and understandable. The problem is that there are moments when problems are unavoidable, and then the question is what to do about them. And I think, for example, North Korea now is a very good example of a problem that China, for understandable reasons, would like to just keep pushing down the road. And maybe, if there could just be talks, and that would be fine, and just push the problem down the road. But at some point, some problems become so acute and so immediate that we can't push them down the road any longer, and we want to see if there's a way to solve them. And I think that may, more often than not, force China to actually look at solving the problem, not just putting it off. Now, there are other quote-unquote problems that you can keep doing exactly what we've been doing for decades, and that's, for example, Taiwan. We found in a sense, a win-win without having to confront the problem directly or resolve it definitively, and that's worked pretty well. So
even for Trump.
Even for Trump, it took a little bit of doing. So I think it very much it really depends on, to me at least, it's a little bit issue specific. Even if there are there's a generic Chinese approach to things and maybe a generic American approach to things as we've described them. In some areas, those two things can coexist perfectly well. And in other areas, you get a more pressure exerted to resolve something or to try and resolve it. So,
okay, great. So my question is about the term Thucydides trap, and Professor Graham Allison coined this phrase and elaborated on this rather pessimistic term. And he warned that over the past 500 years of human history, 12 of 16 end up having the shooting wall. And what's more, he argued that the Thucydides trap has arisen between the United States and China in the Western Pacific in the recent years. So do you think we have learned enough lessons to avert Thucydides trap so this phrase would be a thing of the past?
My short answer is I hope so, but I don't know so. I hope so in that I think it is profoundly in the interest of both China and the United States to avoid it. So if something is in the interest of both countries to avoid, then they ought to find ways to avoid it. But there is, unfortunately, always room for miscommunication, miscalculation, misjudgment. That more often than not is what leads to conflict. It's and as we say, the only thing worse than an intended conflict is an unintended one. So I think that puts a premium on communication, on talking, on being very open with one another in an attempt. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly because if trust is not 100%, and it can't be, then as much as you communicate, you may not, the other party may not believe you. But nonetheless, it puts a premium on that to try to see where conflicts may be, what could spark a conflict in the relationship, and to try to diffuse it or to manage it ahead of time so that we don't wind up in that trap. I think most of the, to me, probably the one that's most prone to creating a challenge or misunderstanding is probably South China Sea. And we spent a lot of time when I was in government talking to our Chinese counterparts about that, just trying to make sure that we understood each other. But that's the one that would concern me most as being susceptible to a misunderstanding and then possibly a miscalculation.
Yeah, but from my observation, China has been very cautious and slow to take up leadership in certain areas like One Road, One Belt and AIIB, China is very proactive. But in other cases, for example, China simply blocks change or abdicates the exercise of power. For example, in reforming some international institutions like IMF, WTO, and United Nations. So why does China, contrary to many people's belief, as a rising power that is poised to challenge and reshape the global order, play a role of status quo power?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
In many of these important institutions.
That's a great question. And I think it goes to this profound, at least in my judgment, and I'm not an expert, but I think it goes to this contradiction that we see from our perspective in China between a very, very strong desire to, totally understandable, to maintain stability, both at home and in the immediate region, on the one hand, which leads you to be more of a status quo power. You don't want to create problems, make problems, because that could just lead to something that you can't control or predict. But on the other hand, as a country that has emerged so vividly on the international stage and has grown in such extraordinary ways, there's also a natural tendency to want to, use that newfound position and power, and that leads you to take non-status quo action sometimes. And I think that there's a tension within China and within the ruling elites between those two tendencies. And so, on the one hand, acting very conservatively, and on the other hand, sometimes acting, from our perspective, aggressively. And I don't mean necessarily militarily aggressively, but pushing the envelope a little bit. So I think you wind up with an ongoing contradiction. But in fairness, as you know, we have in the United States, we have big swings in our foreign policy over many generations, where we have different groups, different camps. Sometimes one is more ascendant than the other. Whether you have
Jeffersonian,
this whole tension,
Wilsonian,
precisely,
Jacksonian,
exactly. So that's been a constant in our history. So it's normal that there are different tendencies, but I think China, it's almost magnified, multiplied by the sheer, not just the sheer size of the country, but just the extraordinary mobilization of the country that exists over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's, I think that's the challenge for Chinese leadership. How do you deal with the very understandable energy that exists to act in a way commensurate with your newfound position and power and strength, but at the same time not throw a wrench in the status quo?
So my last question is about whether the United States has overstretched itself. I mean, there are lots of examples, evidence, or arguments about it, but I want to focus on 800 military bases around the globe by the United States. And these bases are everything from massive military compound to small airstrip in the middle of the ocean. And, there are lots of troops stationed around the world, in South Korea, in Japan, in Germany. And it's very expensive. It costs over $70 billion, almost to $100 billion. So my question is it worth pumping that much money out of United States economy to keep these bases open on the far corners of the globe? So, the Trump's rhetoric is all about withdrawing from the world, but turns out he spent $54 billion extra in terms of military spending. So, I mean, overstretching is a huge debate, and what do you see of United States' next step to keep the status quo, or to reorient into other areas?
I guess to break it down a little bit, just to focus on bases themselves. you know, you can look at it in different ways. Yes, you can look at it as being a not insignificant expense. On the other hand, you can look at it as, particularly, and it depends very much on the individual arrangements that you have, who's actually paying for what. Some of these arrangements are very good and cost-effective for us, and they allow us to basically have a position and a presence far away that would otherwise be very challenging. And if we had to mobilize in the event of contingency of some kind from the United States as opposed to a forward deployed base, that would wind up being a hell of a lot more expensive in some kind of problem emergency. But I think the main question is, you know, what are they for? Less the cost, and what are they for? And that also depends. But I think in the case of the Asia Pacific, for example, we put a premium on freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce, mobility, and essentially that presence is to make sure that there's a relative guarantee of that. Not offensive, but defensive, in the sense of making sure that there's a power in place to prevent any kind of crisis from erupting that challenges the freedom of commerce, freedom of navigation, etc. That's the main purpose. You know, we're a country that is like China, also quite dependent on trade, despite efforts to make trade a little bit more difficult. You know, you've got, in our case, 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States. We have a very strong interest in maintaining access to those consumers, and in part our military helps guarantee that. Obviously, one thing that's changed is we had a very heavy deployment in the Middle East, principally to ensure the security of energy resources. That's in some ways less of an issue now because American energy production has increased so much. On the other hand, it's a global market, so it's even if we are in effect self-sufficient, if there's a crisis and the flow of energy is interrupted in some other part of the world, it still has an effect economically, and it has an effect on our part. So it's a long way of saying I think you have to look at you have to ask the question, what are the, when you ask, is this forward presence worth it? Is it worth the cost? The first immediate question is, what's it for?
Yeah.
So
I had an interesting observation of what Henry Kissinger reacted to Trump, and he talked with Jeffrey Goldberg, and he also, put some positive light on what Trump meant to America's role in the world. He said that it would enable the United States to establish coherence between its foreign policy and its domestic situation. He said that there is a gap between the public perception of the role of the United States and the elite's perception. So there's a mismatch in this. And we see that Trump is like flip-flopping all the time. So is he playing certain strategy to try to close this gap? Is it like widening the gap?
I wish I knew.
I just saw lots of Trump supporters very disappointed after he issued the command to bomb Syria. Very disappointed.
Look, I mean, the way I put it is that he wanted to build a wall, but instead he's run into a wall, and that wall is reality. And there's certain things that happen that don't conform to your ideology, and then you have to decide: are you going to stick to your ideology, or are you going to deal with the problem? In the case of Syria and the chemical weapons, I think he did the right thing because a norm was established after World War I, where the world basically said we won't use chemical weapons in armed conflict. And when that norm is violated, if you allow it to be violated with impunity, then the norm will disappear. And that's going to make the world a more dangerous place for all of us, including the United States and China. So, in my judgment, it was actually a kind of status quo thing to do in trying to uphold a norm. And we have, and it was, of course, you're exactly right, in total contradiction with his campaign and much. I mean, that Trump became the champion of the so-called liberal international order, one of its components, is ironic.
So the mismatch would continue, and the
I
coherence
think
would not be established.
that would be my guess. And
Yeah.
And then in any government, a lot depends on the people you surround yourself with, and who you listen to, who you don't. And most of the people who are now in positions of authority in the government are people who are very much part of this overall tradition of international norms and rules and institutions, and trying to defend them and uphold them. But there are a few others who are in senior positions who want to, figuratively speaking, blow everything up. And how that plays out, I don't know. I mean, to me, the big question is, the debate that we're confronting is this debate between open and closed.
Yeah.
And do you, given all of these very challenging forces of change, are you better off, as we were saying last week, playing defense?
Yeah, hunkering down.
Building the wall, hunkering down, or is the better solution to remain open and connected and try and shape the forces of change and direct them in a more positive way, and to keep with the bridge image instead of the wall image. I think it's the latter. Trump came in saying it was the former, but I think reality suggests that there aren't walls high enough. I mean, trade is the best example, one of the best examples. Just about 50 cents on every dollar of a quote-unquote Chinese product sold in the United States goes back to the United States.
Yeah.
So we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if we put up high tariffs or barriers.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think the larger challenge, I think, with China, where I think the president is right, is there is a lack of reciprocity in the economic relationship, by which I mean it's much easier for Chinese to invest in the United States than for Americans to invest in China.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. And that's hard to sustain.
Yeah.
There are requirements on technology transfer or access in China that we don't impose on Chinese companies doing business here. That's hard to sustain. If you have these big, it's less the imbalance in the trade itself. It's more the imbalance in what are the rules that surround it. China's been able to get away with some of these differences by saying it's a developing country, but when you get to and of course by some measures, per capita measures, yes, but the size of the economy is such, and the role that China plays and the weight that it has around the world is such that I don't think it's going to be able to continue to do that for a long time. But it's also very positive to me to see China playing a very, I think, positive role, ironically, with something where I think we made a mistake, which was with the infrastructure bank.
Yeah.
But that's been a positive so far. It's been well run, managed, thoughtful. That's a net plus. Yeah,
that's like the chessboard traditional strategy.
Exactly. I think that was big. I think we made a mistake. Anyway, but these are great questions. And
thank you so much.
Keep me posted on your pursuits. Good to see you.
I think Bobby is a nice picture.
All right. For us. Bobby's a good one.
Bobby's a good one.
All right.
I never had a picture
of Bobby Kennedy here.
Yeah.
All right.
Bobby.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great to see you. Thanks.
Great to see you. Yeah.